Welcome to the 5th session of our Community Change webinar series. Today's session is entitled The Dynamics of Social Change, hosted by Tamarack's Sylvia Cheuy with special guest Dr. Frances Westley. On the cover of Getting to Maybe, How the World Has Changed, a book co-authored by Frances Westley, readers are so boldly told, this book is for those who are not happy with the way things are and would like to make a difference. This book is for ordinary people who want to make connections that will create extraordinary outcomes. And this book is about making the impossible happen. Today, Frances and Sylvia will discuss the role of leaders in driving change forward and the new approaches integral to the change process. We've come together today to be inspired and to learn about large-scale change and the people who lead it. So let me introduce you to our speakers. I'd like to welcome Frances Westley and Sylvia Cheuy to the call. Sylvia leads Tamarack's Deepening Community Learning Team, and she offers coaching, leadership, and support to Tamarack's community partners through learning events, and in her role as editor of Engage, Tamarack's award-winning e-magazine. Prior to joining Tamarack full-time, Sylvia was the director of Headwaters Communities in Action, that's the HCIA, a citizens leadership group that fosters collaborative action in support of a long-term vision of well-being for Ontario's Headwaters region. Tamarack played a key role in launching HCIA, and Sylvia's experience in the startup and growth of this award-winning regional collaborative has given her first-hand experience in the joys and challenges of working collaboratively to advance a shared community agenda within a predominantly rural region. Sylvia is a skilled facilitator who draws from her training in a variety of methodologies to encourage people to think creatively together. She's a proven track record for securing funding to support innovative community projects. While serving on the board of Community Living Dufferin, CLD, she was instrumental in securing $2.8 million in funding for CLD's new shared home with Theatre Orangeville. Sylvia recently completed her master's diploma in social innovation at the University of Waterloo, where she explored opportunities to create change within regional food systems. Frances is a renowned scholar and consultant in the areas of social innovation, sustainable development, strategic change, visionary leadership, and interorganizational collaboration. She is co-author of the best-selling book, Getting to Maybe, How the World Has Changed, which focuses on the dynamics of social innovation and institutional entrepreneurship in complex adaptive systems. Her work has been highly influential in Tamarack's overall thinking and development. Before joining the University of Waterloo, Frances Westley was the director of the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies 2005 to 2007 at University of Wisconsin-Madison. Other positions that she has previously held include the James McGill Professor of Strategy at McGill's University Faculty of Management, Director of the McGill-DuPont Initiative on Social Innovation, and Director of the McGill-McConnell Master's Program for National Voluntary Sector Leaders. Dr. Westley is the recipient of several awards, including the Corporate Knights Award and the Ulysses S. Seal Award for Innovation in Conservation. We're so happy to share that both Sylvia and Frances will be with us at the Community Change Institute this fall in Toronto. Welcome to both of you. I'll turn this over to Frances and Sylvia now for what proves to be a very exciting conversation.
Thanks so much, Devin. Thank you. And thank you for the beautiful introduction. One of the things that that may not have been obvious, and one of the things that is makes me happy about today's call in particular, is I had the privilege of learning with Frances as she led the Master's Diploma in Social Innovation that I was part of at the University of Waterloo. So I'm so excited to have the opportunity to connect with you, Frances. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, it's wonderful to be here, Sylvia. Nice to reconnect with you. And yes, Devin, thank you for that lovely introduction.
So maybe to start us off, Frances, you know, you've clearly been a pioneer and leader in this idea of social innovation and social change, not just as a teacher, but also as a champion and an observer of it as a movement. And so I'm curious, from your perspective, if you can maybe share with us a little bit with how did you get here? What was your own path? And what are the questions that you're really exploring these days when you think about social innovation and change?
Well, yes, I've always been interested throughout my entire career in the issue of transformation, of how systems, from individuals to large societies, transform, change in deep and purposeful ways. I was an academic. I did a PhD and went directly into a teaching job, first at University of Western Ontario. And at that point, I was quite interested in new religious movements and experiences of personal transformation in those movements. And so that's, in a sense, how my interest first developed. But then I moved to McGill to work in the business school. I became much more concerned with large organizational change and transformation. And at that point, I began to zero in on this issue of dynamics. Business school is a good place to look at that because there's been a lot written about how big, complex organizations transform and change, and the relationship between the individuals who are in those organizations and those change processes. And so there's a lot of very sophisticated ideas around that. However, as time passed, I began to be a bit restless with being only inside the academy. I felt that, I had learned a tremendous amount about understanding not only, the process of change, but actually how to assist people to do that. And so I began to move to much more active engagement with external groups who were working for change. And initially this was very focused on environmental issues. I had a lot of concern, as many of us do, about what's happening to the air and the water, the animals, and the environment in which we live. And so I got involved with two groups of what I think of as value-driven scientists. One who was working on sort of endangered species. This was Buzz Holling and his Resilience Alliance group, and the other working on endangered species, which was one of the IUCN subgroups called the Conservation Breeding Specialist Group. And so they were really working on trying to actively engage communities and key stakeholders in preserving endangered species, or in actually finding a better balance between the social and ecological properties of communities around the world. And so I got very involved in working with them, both in helping to design processes that could impact us for engagement, and also trying to understand, how effective they were being in these processes. And much of my writing and academic work was involved with that as well. Then, as was mentioned earlier by Devin, I had an invitation from the McConnell Foundation to get involved in working with voluntary sector organizations across Canada, many of whom were deeply involved in trying to change and innovate. But within that program, I had the privilege of working with over 120 really astonishing leaders. And there was a subgroup of those organizations, generally smaller organizations, who had a different kind of characteristic, a different stamp. They were very, very innovative, less involved with service delivery, less hampered by, being in a large system with all the bureaucratic elements which that implies, more nimble, and more interested in trying to be catalysts for change. So I began to zero in, along with Brenda Zimmerman, who I was working with then, and Rick Young and Michael Patton, who had been involved in the McGill McConnell program, on those kinds of organizations and processes. And we got support from DuPont Canada, who were very interested in innovation, in really creating a think tank, which laid the groundwork for the book, Getting to Maybe. So, it's been, the journey has taken many different forms, but it retains this interest in trying to understand those dynamics of social change and social innovation, and then how one can actually, from a position of an academic, how can one be of service in supporting and helping those people who are most active in those change efforts.
I think one of the biggest gifts in your work is, for those who are actively, got their heads down trying to figure out innovation, it's often hard to hold a perspective over time, or to see some of the patterns. And the real power, I think, of having people like yourself able to observe those patterns and see, where they shift and change and how to be much more intentional about them is a huge and much needed dimension or ingredient in how we kind of disrupt things and create new realities for folks.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for saying that, Sylvia. I mean, I do feel that that is something that scholars, researchers, and academics can contribute. I'm often kind of alarmed how seldom it actually happens.
My next question for you, I
Yes.
think, like many, the book Getting to Maybe was such a gift as I was, in the trenches of trying to make change happen in a rural community that was pretty slow to want to try newfangled ideas. And just to be able to have that process be mapped and normalized, I think was a huge godsend, and gave me lots of energy and hope and faith to keep trucking along. I was stunned actually when I realized it's been 10 years since you released that book, and it's been so foundational. And I'm really curious to kind of ask you, reflecting on that decade since the book was released, how have you seen the field of social change evolve?
Well, it really, around social innovation, it's really exploded, I think. Particularly in Europe, there's been a huge interest in looking at social change from using the kind of whole system lens that we have adopted at SIG and at Weiser. And this has been spurred even further by the EU putting together enormous funds for investing in projects. So I've had the privilege of being on the advisory board of two of the first rounds of 2 award-winning projects. I was on both advisory boards, and the momentum is enormous. I mean, both of them are multi-country. They have academics and practitioners involved. They have projects. They're doing cases. They have very large workshops. And I really am pleased to say that I think that the Canadian perspectives on social innovation, including but not limited to my own, very much have influenced the way that work is going. And so they've been taking on big issues in Europe. They've been taking on the migration crises. They've been taking on, some of the real problems with conflict and ethnic conflict and governance that we read about all the time in the paper. And these projects are deeply involved in that and trying to find ways to get through what sometimes seems like impossible situations. And here in Canada, I think we've seen a similar kind of explosion in, particularly I would say out west in BC and Alberta. There's been some major government commitment in a couple of areas, and there have been corporate commitments and just a proliferation, I think, of activities. So I think it's really grown beyond what we would ever imagining when we began Social Innovation Generation, which started around 2007, 2008. So that's been 10 years too, and we didn't really expect to see it spread this quickly. I just think that is something where people feel strongly is needed. As you were saying before, I think it tapped a vein, it tapped a nerve in among people who had been struggling along, doing this kind of work for a long time, and suddenly it made them feel that they weren't alone, and that there were ways to connect to other people. So it's been very gratifying.
Well, and certainly that sense of a movement now globally, I mean, and some of the projects that you now know are underway, they're further going to, I think, enrich our understanding of how change happens, and with a real lens on how place, distinct in different places, plays a role or influences some of those dynamics.
Yes, exactly.
So with that in mind, I know certainly that there's lots of folks on this call who are actively in the field trying to make change happen in their place, be that at a neighborhood level or at a community level. So how, in your opinion, how do you think the notion of place affects the dynamics of a social change effort? And if you're really aware of that, how might folks leverage that?
Well, I mean, I think place is crucial. One of the points that we make in Getting to Maybe is that you don't start in any abstract sense. You start where you are, and that is what's calling to you in your immediate environment, in your communities, in your relationships, and in terms of your own capacities, your own development, your own gifts and skills that you bring to it. And there's it has always appeared to work best when those things come together. So, for example, you know, I live in a rural part of Ontario at the moment, and when I look around me, I you know, see a young woman who's a neighbor of mine of Dutch descent who has, you know, been fascinated by food and fascinated by the number of organic farmers in this area producing meat, vegetables, etc., but without any kind of effort to coordinate a market. So, you know, she located that. She said, you know, here's a gap. And, you know, what we need is to develop some mechanisms and means for connecting these particular farmers to markets. So, you know, she sort of started in with what she knew about, you know, about food and what she knew about how to make connections with people, and she's one of these people who, you know, can make good connections easily. And she began to set up this network, and so, you know, I mean, she started where she was. We just got back from, you know, a Banff summer school that we were running, where one of the women there was Linda Thomas, who many people will know, who's is a judge in Alberta in one of the First Nations communities. And she, you know, what she wanted to do was to try to persuade the court system where she was involved to bring in, you know, ideas of Indigenous justice and involve elders in making those decisions. So she started with the people she knew, the issues she knew. That's what called her. Now, you know, I think sometimes place is not geographical. Sometimes I do think that place has to do with a professional community. And I remember many years ago, one of my first studies of the dynamics of change was looking at, you know, Bob Geldof, the musician, when he started the Live Aid movement. And, you know, he had this feeling of being, you know, startled and upset by famine in Ethiopia at that point, and feeling that, you know, he just had to do something about it. But, you know, he was an Irish musician, he lived in England, so, you know, he didn't rush off and join a development organization and fly off to, you know, try to do it himself. He organized the music community because that's what he knew. And for, you know, that wasn't so much place-based as professionally based. It was a community of peers which he understood very well. So he said, how can I use these dynamics, which I know, to affect a change in this, you know, adjacent area? And you know, was able, you know, to raise a lot of money and to circumvent some of the bureaucracies of the aid system at that point to bring money very directly. Now, there were problems. It wasn't perfect, but so it isn't always that it's a physical place, but it very often is, because, you know, to be an effective change agent, to be an effective innovator, you have to start with who you are and where you are, and you have to have faith that that is in fact the way you can be most effective. You can't be most effective by being somebody else. You can't be most effective by trying to, you know, work in an area where you know very little, because there is so much around us that calls to us immediately. And if it calls to you, it calls to you. It's your capacity. You can see it.
Yeah.
Another person can't. So that's where you start. And I think place is very important to that.
That's really, really helpful. And a good reminder, you know, we all have to start from where we are. I know that that we've talked a lot about that there are dynamics that we always see in social change efforts. And so one of those pieces that's implicit, I think, when you talk about place and knowing yourself is there's an emotional element, there's a caring, right?
Yes.
There's a passion around something. And
Yes.
I've heard you now mention a few times relationships, who you know.
Yes.
So it isn't just you. So, I mean, for me, those are kind of coming up as two really important dynamics that you need to be both aware of and willing to leverage as you think about how how you might bring forward a social change effort. Are there other really important dynamics that in all the observations say, if you pay attention to relationships, if you pay attention to your own passion and what you know and the questions you're holding, those are two really good anchors. What else? What are the other dynamics that you think would be really important?
Well, I think that, you're in an embedded set of relationships. I mean, that's what is the essence, the essential aspect of the social world around you, and also the environmental world around you. You are part of a system. And so recognizing that you are in this web of connections of meanings and passions and beliefs, but also a web of connections of relationships to place, to environment, to other people, is a very, very good place to start. I mean, knowing that dynamic is there. So one of the ways we work with that, and we touch on this again maybe, but I still find both of these aspects extremely important in helping people to understand how to navigate through change processes. One is the fact that time does matter, that most innovation processes do go through stages and phases. And we've long used the adaptive cycle to partly try to explain this because it is a heuristic, a model that's developed to explain, kind of normal dynamics of change in all living systems. When you try to use it to look at innovation, you recognize that there really is a sort of a back loop, which are very early stages of innovation that have a certain feel, that attract certain kinds of people, require certain sorts of abilities, and then there is a kind of front loop, which in fact involves often different other kinds of people and other kinds of dynamics in order to secure the good idea, to build it, to give it depth and strength, to scale it eventually. You're going to need to secure resources from the larger system. And when you're involved in action itself, it's sometimes helpful to realize that the action has phases, and the kind of people involved and the kind of skills you need to use, the kind of experience and the feel of those stages are different. That is almost like a roadmap, and it is helpful to understand that. Again, it's a heuristic. It's not perfect. It's not a model that absolutely describes every process, but it allows, I think, people who are trying to create change to not feel, as you said before, sort of lost in the dynamics itself, but rather say, okay, this is where I am. This is where I need to go. So that's one. The other one that I think is equally important is the issue of what we call scaling up. And we know that most innovations that become successful in changing the really big problems that people are trying to address in the first place require you to go beyond, a very local solution and secure it in a broader economic, policy, political, cultural arena. Otherwise it only lasts as long as your efforts last. And most people who are passionate about change in this space really want to see the system change, the system that created the problem in the first place. So it's kind of helpful to be thinking about that cross-scale issue right from the beginning. Recently I've been working with some colleagues on a paper about, how do you recognize a promising social innovation in the early stages? Because the other piece that we've been working on is looking at long historical, over 150 years, where an initiative or new idea comes to change the whole system, and sometimes it takes that long, right? So how do you look at, an innovation and say, yeah, this one has real system changing promise? And one of the things you look for is are people considering, the kind of relationships they have up through the political system in which they exist, the kind of relationships they have to the broader economic system right at the beginning, very, very early stages, and not just simply thinking about, the immediate local problem. Because, if what you're doing really has legs, is sticky, its time has come, it's important, then you can find yourself in that arena of needing to deal with these broader political issues very, very quickly, and many, many innovations back away from that, or innovators back away from that, or founder at that stage. So it's really important to be kind of thinking that what you're doing is something that's nested in a system that has layers of hierarchy, and that ultimately, success looks like the capacity to cascade up through that hierarchy, as well as being able to spread out to, duplicate the initiative in various other geographical places.
That's actually really, really helpful. It reminds me of a comment that I think John Kania made when he was speaking about some of the, the cautions around the rapid uptake of collective impact. And he was saying, we keep investing in programs and wonder why systems don't change, right?
Right.
And that in fact, they were never designed intentionally to change the system. Right. So, what you're reminding us, I think, of really powerfully is it can be easy to, because, of funding incentives and whatever, it's easy to think of your social change activities as a program.
Right.
But if you really, really want to change the system, you need to be equally deliberate about and intentional about embedding strategies of systems change into that work if you want it to be sustainable, right?
Exactly. Nicely said.
Yeah, it is, the lens of putting the system glasses on and thinking of yourself embedded within it, not distinct from.
Yes,
really helpful. Really, really helpful.
Exactly.
So there are lots of folks on this call and whose work is very much about making change happen. What are the most important skills or abilities that you think folks who are committed to being change agents or catalysts need to sort of cultivate for themselves so that they can continue to be successful as change agents and making social change happen, community change happen?
Again, I think if you keep that stages and phases idea in your mind, then you realize that there's a wide variety of changes. Of skills, and I think that one of the things that many change agents discover as they go through this process is that they need a team, because not everybody is equally good at all the stages. And so in the very early stages, what we call the back loop, when an idea is just forming, when there's been there's been some sort of major problem and people are really trying to kind of make sense and come up with solutions. So it's even before an idea has crystallized. Then the capacity to convene, to have conversations with other people, to listen deeply, to help other people to express what they're feeling or thinking, and then be able to find the patterns in that to be able to make some sense. It's really a kind of a sense-making capacity and a connecting capacity is really important, because, again, going back to your earlier statement, if you want to give birth, in a sense, or to create something that is going to have real potential to change the system, listening deeply and standing still, as Michael Patton would often say, and sort of trying to get a sense of, what is this problem? What is this challenge? What is this system? Before you jump too quickly to, oh, well, I know what we need. We need to do this. And that's that's often very hard, because I think a lot of change agents are really action-oriented, and they just want to jump in, and I think we should do this, and I think we should do it now. And one of the things I learned from working for so many years with Michael Patton is him saying, no, thinking and standing still is a form of action. So you do need, in a sense, to listen hard, to talk, to be open, to be open to all elements, to not get yourself into an us-them kind of mindset, but rather to recognize that we are, as you said, embedded in the system we're trying to change. So let's listen to our own feelings, but to the thoughts and feelings of others as well. So that's really early stage. And out of that, may start to develop some ideas. And, there usually be more than one. They'll be floating around. It could be like this. It could be like that. It's half-formed, et cetera. And so we find that many social change agents actually have to start to move into something which is more like a brokering relationship to the ideas that are out there. Hopefully they've got other people engaged at this point. They're not alone, so there's a lot more, kind of manpower there. But on the other hand, that means they're going to be competing ideas, and some of those ideas, are going to, be able to move forward. Some aren't. There's going to have to be choices made. A lot of partnering and brokering have to happen. And then, moving from that to, the front loop is a real issue. It's a difficult passage. The resilience folks call it the poverty trap, but it really means you can just get stuck in a place where there's lots of ideas, and you're trying to keep everybody involved, and you don't want to say no to anyone, and therefore nothing really goes. So there's a real moment of choice where you have to make that difficult choice. And at that point, once you've made the choice and you've decided on this, we're going to try to go with this, we're going to try to go with that, recognize that there are people who are attached to other kinds of ideas who are going to be angry, who are going to feel left behind. But if you don't, in a sense, pivot there, make that hard choice, then you never get anywhere.
And you lose everybody.
And you lose everybody, right? Because you get stuck. And, I remember when we were working with lots of voluntary sector organizations, there was this kind of fatigue with, endless sort of meetings where everybody would get together and generate ideas, right? Because nothing ever happened after that, right?
And most of these people were passionate about taking action, which is why they came together in the first place.
Exactly. And so then things just sort of peters away, and it was a great experience, et cetera. And everybody got to participate, but nothing actually happened. So, that point of pivot, it up to that point, it can feel like this is a really participatory thing, and that's great. But there are moments when, in fact, it's not participatory. I mean, a choice has to be made. The resources have to be pulled around one way forward, and that can be a really hard transition for a lot of people who are used to working at it, say at a community level. Because then the next stage, the next set of skills, as you move into the front loop there, really are the ones of kind of selling. And that's where you are going to have to secure. You're going to have to secure. You're going to have to take advantage of policy windows. You're going to have to get people in government who are like what you're doing. You're going to have to secure more funding for that initiative that you believe is the one that should go forward, that can make the kind of change. You may find that you're, particularly if it's kind of radical, you hit a fair amount of kind of cultural resistance, and so you're going to have a whole strategy around, what the private sector would call marketing, sort of like preparing the ground for people to feel that this is just what everybody needs, right? And so that may be a very different set of skills than the back skills, right?
Yeah.
So
it really emphasizes why collaboration is so critical, right? Because it's rare, as I think about it and listen to you, that you would find one individual that holds all of those skills.
Yes,
and or can hold the objectivity enough or clarity enough to know when to shift gears. Because when you're in the mud, it's hard to see it.
And it's one of the reasons why I continue to be, even though I know it's a losing battle, but I continue to be a little resistant to the word leadership when it comes to social change, because I think that sort of posits that you are the leader, and it's your job to take the explorers forward and all the way up the mountain, the leader. And that can get you, that can back you into a position where you have no flexibility, where you can't really hand off to other people, where, too much is expected and you're up on a kind of a pedestal. And I find that the people who are very effective at this usually don't like to be called leaders, because they don't want this image of leader follower. They like to be catalysts. They like to be molds. There's a certain subversive element to some of this. They're connectors, they're brokers, they're sense makers. But and all of those can are certainly elements of leadership. But they're less at the lone person at the front. It's much more a kind of an embedded activity.
Yeah.
Which is why we like to use system entrepreneur as opposed to leader, because I think it's a slightly different skill set. And and among those skills and those sort of tendencies is it's a kind of disposition. Like, leaders like to lead. I think system entrepreneurs like to stay under the radar. They don't actually like to be the person who the spotlight's on. So it's kind of a different disposition as well.
Well, and I would also say, the flip side of, if there's a leader, then the rest of us can abdicate, right? And we can say, it's your job to fix it. And in fact, given the complexity and the need for all those different skills, that undermines the collaboration. Yeah, so that makes good sense as well.
Exactly. Yep.
Well, I'm very aware of the time. I can't believe how quickly the time has flown, because there's still lots of questions, I'm sure, that I'm holding, and I'm aware that others on the line must be as well. So I do want to just invite folks to, if you haven't already, post your questions in the chat box, and we're going to be happy to sort of take on and respond to those. I do see we have a question already from Monica, and she's asking, the story you shared about the young woman near you who's sort of mobilizing all the organic farmers.
Right.
The question is, did she have a level of education and or resources to support her to lead this process?
She has a college degree, but she actually is just one of these people who has these inherent kind of gifts. She's a wonderful connector. She connects, effortlessly to people. She's intelligent, and she is deeply, deeply interested in food. And so, she has young children, and so she's not working full time, but when they're in school, she connects to, she goes around and connects to local farmers, and she's talked to them a lot. So she began to see that, the problem was a problem of brokering, of finding a way to really create markets for this food. So no, not in a way that I would describe that, she went off and got a degree in marketing and then set out to do this. She just was following a particular passion, and she had the gift to connect and to make sense of that. So
beautiful.
I also find that's the case. To be honest, even though I have endless amounts of education. It's ridiculous. Once you get a PhD, it's like you spent half your life in a university. But I find that, the things that have been most useful, or what, I experienced as most helpful to people, weren't anything that I actually learned. It was just sort of, strange kind of capacities that one has. So I shouldn't even say that, because I'm speaking from university, because I'm...
You're being subversive. This is good.
I'm being subversive, right? but I'm not sure that the way our formal education system works at the moment, that it really equips people to do this kind of thing.
Well, that's a beautiful segue into the next question. So Masura has asked us, the question is, can innovation be institutionalized?
Well, that is a really interesting question. So I'm going to take a slight deviation. There was a sociologist, a classic sociologist. His name was Max Weber. Some of you may be very well of him, and because I did my first degree, my PhD in sociology, I had to read a lot of Weber. He's kind of hard to read. But there was a piece that he did on authority, where he talked about the fact that you have different kinds of authority, and the ones he mentioned was charismatic authority. Of these really, really charismatic individuals, leaders, who create a group of followers who kind of try to enact and bring to life their vision. And he said many of these organizations, a lot of them were religious, but we know all kinds of organizations that are led by charismatic people like that. They founder when there's a succession problem, when some leader dies or has to move on, etc. So he talked about what he called a routinization of charisma. And he said, there are ways to embed that kind of relationship that the followers and the charismatic leader have into sort of organizational systems and structures. But it's hard to do, and it doesn't always happen. And when you go into, I mentioned at the beginning, there's a very rich literature in the private sector and in business schools around innovation processes. You find there a very rich literature on this notion of institutionalizing innovation. So there are groups of firms, you think of ones like 3M, or I think DuPont thinks themselves in this category too, who are continuously innovating. They and many software companies are like this too. Their license to operate depends on a continual flow of innovative products. They can never kind of rest on their laurels because the market just moves right out from under them. So when you look at those organizations closely, you see some institutionalization of innovation processes. So I'll just name a few. One of the things that you see is that there's a kind of a pivotal role. In the private sector, they call it management up-down. It's kind of a middle management position, somebody who's actually responsible, who has enough connection to the front lines where people are solving problems all the time, and enough connections to the sort of the top of the organization where people are making strategy to be able to see what kind of new solutions and responses that have created the front line actually have important strategic significance for the organization. So there's this kind of up-down role of moving things from, because innovation, going back to the question of place, tends to happen in real time at the front lines with people trying to solve problems. But it is kind of micro level, this individual in the middle is actually doing the scaling up issue. They're thinking all the time about how you connect a program or a product or a new idea to a much larger strategic initiative, direction, etc. So you see that. You also see dynamics of creating very small innovative teams and protecting them and funding them in a highly competitive environment to come up with new products, and then exercising the discipline of that choice, where 10 teams, one innovation goes forward and then captures all the resources for the next stage. So they have they've basically institutionalized innovation processes.
Oh, very good. This actually, there's a question here now from Maria, which actually builds on this a little bit, I think. She's saying, I have been reflecting on emergence within a network, when people are empowered to self-organize around their ideas, and amazing ideas are out of all the different brains working together from a shared purpose. And she says, noting that you have reminded us that we're all nested in systems and that there's layers in that hierarchy. Her question is, do you think that hierarchy and power imbalances are inevitable in social change movements themselves?
Well, power is an interesting dynamic. We have a whole book, a chapter on that, and getting maybe about the powerful stranger. Power is part of social change. Power is needed to move systems and to change systems. Power also gets vested in certain kinds of roles and certain kinds of positions, and when that happens, people hang on to power. So when it comes to social change, there's two elements there. One is that for the system to really change, that power, in a sense, has to be released. You need to be able to get hold of some of it and attach it to a new way of doing things. a new way of operating a new system. On the other hand, in this kind of endless adaptive cycle loop, as you are successful in that, the change itself starts to be institutionalized, which is different from institutionalizing change process, but saying that, the new invention becomes the status quo. The new way of doing things becomes the way we do things. Then you see a reoccurrence of, or the onset of a kind of rigidity that's associated with positions of power that people refuse to renounce, and which then start to be associated with the status quo. And once again, in a sense, that power, there has to be something which disturbs those power relationships, which releases them, which makes them flexible enough so that, power can move to be attached to a new idea. So it's, I find that it's very difficult for social innovation to succeed in the context without it becoming revolution, which is a very different dynamic. It's hard to succeed in a place where we say, this is all about haves and have-nots. It's all about us and them, and that we have to wrest the power. Part of what we talk about in the Powerful Stranger chapter is that most of the time when the dynamic really gets unlocked is the moment when the person who's trying to catalyze the change recognizes that the system is inside them as well as outside them, and that they have to actually rearrange their own relationship to it, in a sense freeing up, their own power to be really attached to this new thing. And so, if you get into a dynamic where you're just fighting against those who have power and those who don't, it tends to arrest what I think of as the normal flow and development of social innovation. Which doesn't mean that you don't. Which doesn't say that you don't have to find ways to draw some of that power to you. Power that's in the dominant system. Am I being clear? Is that?
Oh, very.
Helpful?
So, it's, what I'm hearing you say is power is a dynamic that exists within social change, and we have to be both aware of it, but not attached to it, and be strategic about linking the current power to your emerging idea, but also being aware that we ourselves are, not susceptible to some of those dynamics of power as well.
Yeah, we are susceptible.
And there's benefit to power, but there's also detriment that power can bring. It's not a volatile.
Yeah, it's a volatile commodity. So for that matter, are beliefs. Beliefs that are deeply held can be, a major driver of social change. It can be also an incredible barrier. So, these things aren't good or bad in themselves. They are. And you do have to find out how to work with them and counter them in ways that are flexible and transformative, as opposed to militant and hardwired, in a sense,
Yeah, and as you reminded us, though, they are both out there in the system, but they're also deep within us. So you can't change the system without changing yourself.
Exactly.
So, Anne, I'm watching the time. Why don't we wrap up this part of it with Andrea's question? And she, because it fits really well. She says, how can we shift some of the traditional notions of leadership to really enable other types of leadership to show up and become engaged in some of the change we're trying to make happen?
No, I'm not sure. I'm just not sure I would use the word "how do we shift notions," because this, one of the most effective change agents that I ever saw was Ulysses, who worked with this conservation breed specialist group. He was a chemist, biochemist by trade, but became very involved in endangered species, very passionate about it. And he recognized power hierarchies and the leaders that were in them. His view was, you give deference where it's due, but basically, you know, they can be like the rocks in the stream, and you don't want to get preoccupied. You know, you move around them. You know,
Yes.
you're the water to their rock. You're not. You know, you're not. You have to. If you're in a system and you've got a leader who has this hierarchical position and thinks of themselves as a leader, you know, you don't want to be spending all your energy fighting them. So you give them, you know, the deference, you manage them as best you can. But where you're going to find the energy to create the change, the entrepreneurial energy, is very seldom in those people. It is the people who are working away at the problem, who have the good ideas, and your job as a catalyst is in some ways to protect them from at least in the early stages, from, you know, being squashed by a formal leadership system. You know, a lot of ducking and weaving, really.
Wow. So once again, that subversive entrepreneur as opposed to the formal positional leader.
Yeah, I think so. I think you get really tied up in being a formal positional leader. It requires so much energy just to be that person. It's hard to get a lot of other stuff done.
And yes, got it. And it's about, you know, staying focused on the issue that you're passionate about.
Yeah, exactly.
So, you know, here are some of the notes that really I kind of jotted down as we were talking. For those of us that are really wanting to advance social change, it's about listening hard. It's about standing still, staying open, being able to connect people, broker between people, foster collaboration, and stay focused and driven by the passion and the issue.
Absolutely.
Lovely. Well, I want to thank you so much. This is such a beautiful warm-up for our time together at the end of September. I'm really looking forward to this and exploring some of these ideas more deeply. So thank you so much for today, and I'm going to turn it back over to Devin.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Frances and Sylvia, for sharing your insights and perspectives with all of us on the call today. It's such a fascinating hour to hear you work through all those ideas in a really narrative way, and I feel like the questions really enrich the conversation as well, so thank you so much. I would like to thank again our supporters, Human Resources and Social Development Canada, Maytree Foundation, J.W. McConnell Family Foundation, and the Province of Ontario for making these calls possible. Be sure to sign up to receive Engage magazine. It's our online magazine published monthly. It provides the latest thinking through articles, news, and resources for community change leaders. We invite you to join us for the last session in our Community Change webinar series. During the session entitled Collective Impact 3.0, Liz Weaver and Mark Cabage will be sharing insights about the evolution of collective impact and what it will take to get to transformative community change. So that sounds like a really fascinating one to follow on the heels of this webinar. And finally, the Tamarack team would like to personally invite you all to join us at the inaugural Community Change Institute. It's taking place in the vibrant city of Toronto this fall. It'll be September 26th to 30th. This is a 5-day event. It'll feature 4 world-renowned speakers, including Frances Westley, 40 workshops, and over 250 changemakers from across the globe. Details about this incredible learning opportunity can be found on the events section of our website. So I welcome you to go check that out, and we really do hope to see you face-to-face in Toronto. We'd love to hear from you. Please feel free to send us your feedback to tamarack@tamarackcommunity.ca. Thank you again to Frances and Sylvia, and thank you to everyone for joining us. Have a great day.